Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, welcome you all to this new webinar. First of all, please note that we have simultaneous translation, English-Spanish, Spanish-English. You can choose the language of your preference in the menu below. I will switch to Spanish now. Les decía, tenemos servicio de interpretación simultánea, español-inglés, inglés-español. Vamos a tener de ambos idiomas presentaciones, así que tengan eso en cuenta en el menú vertical, en el menú horizontal inferior en su pantalla pueden encontrar el icono con el idioma de su preferencia. Esta sesión va a ser grabada y vamos a tener también la posibilidad de que todos interactúen a través del icono de Q&A. Pueden allí plantear sus preguntas para los panelistas. Mi nombre es Irene Alfaro, soy directora gerente senior de Arpel. Arpel es la Asociación de Empresas de Petróleo, Gas y Energías Renovables de América Latina y el Caribe. Y estamos muy honrados de ser institución de apoyo en esta iniciativa de Ipieca, con quien venimos trabajando hace muchísimos años de forma conjunta y cooperación en varios proyectos. Sin más, le paso la palabra ahora al moderador de este webinar, Adam Paxi. Adelante, Adam.
Thank you. I'm Adam Pacey. I'm a methane policy advisor at Chevron and chair of the Ipieca Methane Task Force. On behalf of Ipieca, I'd first like to thank Arpel, ACP, and AMEXHI for helping to co-organize this webinar series on this important topic, and OGDC and IOGP for their support. I'm really excited to host a conversation on advanced methane detection and measurement technologies. It's an area where there's been significant technology advances in the last couple of years, and very interesting case studies that our speakers will share on scaling performance and technology. This is part of a three-part webinar series. We hosted a conversation last week on source abatement, and we'll host one next Friday at the same time on methane inventory development. I'm honored to have three experts share their practical experience with you all on implementing technologies and programs for methane detection technologies across their global operations and, in some cases, their Latin American assets. The first speaker is Arsena Hakobian, who's a methane detection and verification advisor at Chevron. Arsena is a PhD atmospheric chemist by background who has 15 years of experience with field measurements of methane and air quality emissions. She's responsible for leading Chevron's global effort to select and deploy advanced methane detection technologies in order to support Chevron's reduction activities. Arsena, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. Sorry, I'm going to start sharing my screen. There we go. All right, so I am going to skip this since Adam did such a nice job of the introductions. I am so happy that you're joining us today to talk about methane measurements, especially aerial methane measurements. So when we're talking about methane management, in order to have a complete and holistic approach to understanding where the sources of methane emissions are and how we can do a good job of finding them, it is really important to have data and information that lead us to understanding the exact source of measurement, result in actionable data where we can work on mitigation and reduction of methane emissions. In order to do that, we have to deploy advanced methane detection technologies. And in order to do that, we have to have a good understanding of what type of technologies are available on what platforms and how we can deploy them best for specific types of operations, activities, and locations, especially when it comes to scaling up different types of technology. So we're looking for technologies that give us information about where the source of emission is, do a good job of quantification, allow us to understand what the cause, have information to understand what the cause of the emission is, and are scalable, result in actionable data. So going to the next slide, in Chevron, in order to understand different types of technologies, we have tested technologies on different platforms. This is not the total of technologies that we've tested. There are many more on different platforms, but here I'm going to talk about aerial technology, aerial platforms specifically. When we talk about platforms, it's in this case, technology can be installed on satellites, different types of aircrafts flying at different heights, or it can be on drones, so for aerial technologies. When we're the type of, so something to remember is the same type of technology, the same type of sensor can be installed on multiple platforms. As an example, you can have a same sensor on satellites or on aircraft. As you can imagine, the distance, the viewing distance for satellites is much larger than for aircraft, so that results in the differences between the limit of detection of the different technologies. Limit of detection is basically, very simply, is the smallest emission rate that the technology is capable of detecting in a specific set of criteria set forth, like how many times, under what circumstances, all of that. We won't go into those details. When we're talking about satellite detection technologies, each type of technologies and each type of platform has its pluses and minuses. Again, if you remember, we talked about actionable data, where the data results on us understanding where the source of emission is, does a good job of quantification, and is scalable. In this case, satellite technology, for some cases, would work really well, but at this moment, the best that the satellite technology can detect is at 100 kilogram per hour. And that is not for all satellites. It's some satellites cannot detect anything below 1,000 or 2,000 kilogram per hour. What this means is that it's a good scalable solution for super emitters, but then we're missing other different types of emissions. Also, depending on the sites that you're observing, in some areas, satellites have challenges with clouds. So for aircraft, detection limit is lower, and we have had success in deploying aircraft in different regions of the world. For our measurements, it is scalable. And then when we talk about drones, you have two different types of drones, the ones that are operated with a person that has challenges with scalability, and then the drones that are long distance drones where they don't need line of sights. And so those have the challenges where local flight regulations restrict the use of the types of drones. And also because they fly lower, they have more obstacles that make the flights challenging. Okay, so I've been talking about actionable data and how we use data for mitigation and how it's important. And so I want you guys to look at the two left side pictures for satellite, where we use GHGSat in about 18 sites globally, and then where we use Bridger Photonics in different areas of the globe, including United States, to understand what the emissions are. When we have an emission source identified, the first thing that you want to do is understand what the location and the source of that emission are. And the best place to do that is a desktop analysis to understand whether you have data in this area to be able to do a follow-up. When looking at the picture at the center, you can see that just looking at the data and imagery, you can see where the source of the emission is coming from. So that makes the next step easier. And that's where we're talking about actionable data. One other thing that I want to touch on is different types of drone and satellite drone technology allow us to address differences in different locations. So you can have onshore facilities, you can have offshore facilities, onshore complex facilities. And so all of these result in different types of capabilities and requirements for technologies. So in this case, for technology and detection, we have some information about how we use the data. So the data from advanced detection technologies can be really useful in improving what we understand of our emission inventory. We are also very keen on using the data for understanding what the sources are and mitigation. But in order to do all of this, the technology has to be scalable. The technology has to have accurate data and have a good understanding of its uncertainty. And then you can use different types of technology at different types of location, including operational data, to understand what your sources of emissions are and have better data for reporting and better data for mitigation. And then I have talked about technology for a bit, but I wanted to spend some time and talk about what it means to have all this data. So right now we're talking about three. On the left side of the screen, you see three different sets of data that can be collected. It's the advanced detection technology data. In some places, either voluntarily or by local requirements, there is programs that use optical gas imaging, FLIR cameras for method 21, which is sniffers. So that's detection data, not quantification, that's collected. And then we have operational data. So when you're considering what type of detection technology is a best fit for you, we talked about actionable data. So the technology needs to identify what the source of emission are, so that follow up by people on the ground, by your operational folks, is easier. The technology have to have accuracy in prediction, in identification of the source of emission, where the emission is from. What we also need to consider is how the data from that technology is going to match the data that we already have, because that is where we're going to match data, understand the sources of emissions, and result in mitigation. So when you're collecting satellite or aerial flyover data, and in this case, we have had a lot of deployment of aerial flyover data in different parts of the world. And in collecting the data, it is important to understand how that data fits into your data set where you have operational data, where you can combine those two and understand where your sources of emission are. And then when you have all the data sources collected with each other, this allows you to do predictive analysis, which means that you understand where the emissions are coming from and what your sources of emission are, in order to be able to take mitigative actions before even the emissions take place. So again, keeping methane in the pipe is the result of all of the work that we're doing in order to go from detection technology, aerial flyovers, collecting data, matching it and understanding the source of the emission, and then having this data-rich environment to understand what the next step that we should take for methane mitigation are. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Arsena, for sharing all the good work that you're doing on deploying methane detection technologies. I'd put a plug in while folks are thinking and digesting that presentation to continue to use the Q&A function to submit questions either in English or in Spanish that we could get to at the end of the presentations. Our second speaker today is Elga Pabon, who's a methane reduction technical leader at Ecopetrol. Elga is a chemical engineer by background and has more than 20 years of experience with process engineering and emissions management in the oil and gas sector. Elga, over to you. Thanks for sharing your experience.
Gracias. Buenos días a todos. Gracias por invitarme a este importante webinar. Presentaré de manera resumida las tecnologías de medición de metano que con mi equipo interdisciplinario hemos implementado en nuestra compañía. Nuestra gestión de identificación, detección y cuantificación, sobre todo de reducción de metano, nos ha llevado a nuestra compañía a adherirnos a iniciativas internacionales, iniciativas de coalición por el clima, el aire limpio, iniciativas de cero quemas rutinarias, iniciativas de alianza por el sector, por el metano, el sector petróleo y gas, que es la iniciativa OGMP 2.0, e iniciativa Aiming for Zero. Estamos apalancados también por la resolución colombiana a 466 del año 2022. Hemos hecho en este proceso de gestión una reducción importante de toneladas de metano frente a emisiones de fugas y venteos. Y hemos participado en estudios científicos financiados por UNEP para tecnologías top-down y bottom-up con la Universidad de Carleton. También hemos aplicado tecnologías de medición directa financiadas directamente por nuestra compañía y estamos próximos a planear un estudio de emisiones de metano para identificar o recolectar información de emisiones en pozos abandonados, también financiado por UNIF con la Universidad de McGill. Hemos adquirido al momento reconocimiento Gold Standard que otorga el OGMP 2.0 y frente a esto pues estamos focalizados en una meta de reducción de estos volúmenes de metano de acuerdo al inventario que tenemos establecido desde el año base 2019. Esta gestión de identificación, detección y cuantificación de metano nos ha permitido incorporar conocimiento frente a las tecnologías de medición de cada fuente, tecnologías de medición en aire, top-down y en sitio bottom-up. Hemos probado mediciones específicas para fugas, para venteos. Hemos hecho con el ICP del Instituto Tecnológico análisis sobre satélites para saber si podríamos tener información específica de nuestra fuente de emisión desde esta vista. Hemos aplicado tecnologías de medición en aviones top-down. Hemos probado drones para medir la eficiencia de combustión en TEAS. Y pues básicamente estas tecnologías focalizadas en área, aquí tenemos una explicación un momento más específica de las tecnologías que hemos aplicado. Estas tecnologías lo que queremos es que nos identifiquen efectivamente la fuente de emisión, dónde está, de cuánto es la emisión, para poder nosotros como compañía identificar la acción de reducción. Hemos aplicado en top-down, hemos realizado 4 campañas de medición top-down con la tecnología de Leak Surveyor de Kairos Insight y hemos aplicado la tecnología LIDAR de la compañía Bridger a través del estudio UNEP, del estudio Carleton con UNEP. Básicamente, la tecnología de Leak Surveyor nos ha permitido realizar estas 3 campañas. Es una tecnología que hemos volado a 1500 metros, 3000 metros, 450 metros, resoluciones de 5 metros, detecciones de 10 a 100 kilogramos. Esta tecnología tiene un espectrómetro de absorción de metano que mide la capacidad de absorción del metano en la luz solar, tiene una ubicación con GPS y tiene pues una cámara óptica que le permite visualizar de mejor forma la locación y la unidad operativa donde estamos, nos georreferencia las emisiones y lo mismo que Bridger, que tiene una tecnología patentada, Gas Mapping LIDAR, trabaja con un sensor enfocado, focalizado directamente a metano con mejor resolución, entre 1 a 2 metros, una cuantificación de 3 kilogramos y una altitud para nosotros de vuelo de 200 metros. Estos resultados, como se mencionaba en la presentación anterior, nosotros desde operaciones tenemos que identificar, validar las fuentes georreferenciadas que nos da cada tecnología. Que hemos entendido de esta tecnología? Que pues como son realmente tecnologías de detección de absorción del metano pueden ser impactadas por las mismas condiciones climatológicas. Esto nos ha llevado a que efectivamente nuestras campañas deban ser realizadas en épocas de sequía porque pues la lluvia, las nubes y el mismo viento nos afecta la sensibilidad de la tecnología misma. En fugitivas o en mediciones en sitio bottom-up hemos aplicado para medir fugitivas detección con cámaras OGI, son cámaras que detectan en el infrarrojo. La tecnología en algunas compañías ha mejorado, así que las mismas compañías traen la cámara OGI y el software QOGI que hoy está cuantificando de acuerdo al método propio de cada compañía. También hemos una vez detectado con cámara OGI cuantificado con High Flow Sampler, que es un medidor de metano específico. Depende pues de la cantidad de emisión, del rango de detección de cada uno de los elementos aplicables. Y hemos realizado medición directa en venteos de pozos y tanques, básicamente con medidores ultrasónicos, medidores rotativos. Importante que esta medición de este flujo de gas sea corregido con la cromatografía, que debemos identificar el metano que está saliendo por esa emisión de ese flujo de gas, y así con estas condiciones operacionales con las que se corrige cada uno de los tipos de medición de flujo, poder identificar específicamente en qué sitio estamos venteando este metano y con qué proporción en cromatografía lo estaríamos venteando ese gas natural. También tenemos desarrollo sobre vuelos con drones. Estamos justo en este momento haciendo mediciones directas a la combustión para identificar los hidrocarburos no quemados en nuestras teas, para poder saber si tenemos que mejorar esta eficiencia de combustión. Con el Instituto Colombiano del Petróleo desarrollamos unos análisis específicos sobre resultados de los registros satelitales de Tropomi, para poder focalizar si en nuestras facilidades oil and gas podrían detectarse a este nivel, y pues claramente a esta resolución 7 por 7 kilómetros cuadrados y una detección más allá de los 1000 kg/h, pues no nos fue fácil identificar nuestras facilidades en estos registros satelitales de Tropomi. Y básicamente también entendimos que nuestra geografía colombiana, las condiciones geográficas y climatológicas pueden permitir algún solapamiento de estas nubes de metano por las mismas condiciones antropogénicas que tenemos en nuestro país. Así que con estas detecciones satelitales pudimos identificar que, o pudimos observar que no es fácil para nosotros lograr el objetivo, que es justamente identificar la fuente y la cuantificación de la misma fuente. También hicimos mediciones con el satélite GHGSat, que es un satélite que tiene una detección mucho menor. Y pues para nosotros concluimos lo mismo, a esta distancia lo que requerimos es realmente identificar la fuente, no nos fue fácil poderla desarrollar. Así que las conclusiones que hemos tenido frente a la aplicación de estas tecnologías básicamente es que definitivamente con detecciones satelitales es importante para los superemisores, pero pues ya cuando nosotros vamos a identificar las fuentes, la satelital no nos ayuda mucho. En las tecnologías top-down hemos aprendido que sí debemos entender nuestra condición climatológica para poder realizar los mejores vuelos. Definitivamente cada una de las tecnologías que traen los proveedores pues aportan mejor sensibilidad, mejor detección dependiendo de la tecnología misma. Pues con alguna de las tecnologías que hemos aplicado pues podríamos tener una detección más directa, o focalizarlos de mejor forma en la fuente, y pues con otras que vuelan más alto podría uno tener ahí detecciones en solapamiento de nubes cuando en algún momento tenemos emisiones al mismo tiempo de diferentes fuentes. Y en tecnologías Boronap hemos aprendido que definitivamente cada una de las fuentes debe tener una tecnología específica para poder ser cuantificada de mejor forma. Efectivamente debemos tener claro las condiciones operacionales del momento en el que efectuamos. Para todas las tecnologías es igual, las condiciones operacionales del momento en el que efectuamos nuestro registro, porque son registros instantáneos de alguna manera. Entonces hay que tener claro el flujo, la carga, la composición, las situaciones operativas, y sobre todo tener claro o estimado un mejor tiempo de medición para que el registro pueda ser trazable eh, de acuerdo a las condiciones operativas que tenemos. Nuestros próximos pasos como compañía, pues en este momento es mejorar esta impacto que tenemos, o reducir el impacto que tenemos con proyectos ya identificados en las emisiones de metano que de alguna manera ya tenemos cuantificadas, y continuar con un proceso de identificación de incertidumbre de medición, básicamente focalizados en conciliar estas tecnologías Boronap que venimos ejecutando y tenemos que seguir ejecutando para determinar la incertidumbre y conciliarlas con las tecnologías top-down. De esta manera poder nosotros conocer en qué vía debemos seguir en la aplicación tecnológica y tener muy clara la incertidumbre de la medición de nuestra compañía. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Elga, for sharing what's, I'm sure, been a lot of work for you and your team over the last few years at Ecopetrol. Very impressive. Again, reminder to put questions in the Q&A part of the chat as you're going along, and we'll get to them after our final speaker. Our final speaker is Matt Colasar, who's the Chief Environmental Science at ExxonMobil. At Exxon, Matt leads global advocacy and strategy development on climate and energy transition issues, including methane. Over his 30-year career, Matt has held a variety of leadership positions across Exxon in both the upstream and downstream business. Matt, interested to hear what Exxon has going on these days.
Very good. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. So many of the points I'm going to make have been covered already, so I may go through some of these early slides quickly. And I'll start with, again, I suspect this audience has a pretty keen awareness of this, so there's really just 2 points I want to make on these first 2 slides. And I really just want to focus on the graphic on the top right. And again, I think everyone's aware of this phenomenon. These are atmospheric methane concentrations in the environment over the last 2,000 years. And the gray bar goes back 400,000 years based on core samples and other geological methodologies. And so that really indicates, again, I think most of us know that global atmospheric methane was largely consistent for most of the Earth's history until the Industrial Revolution. And so that's when that curve starts to spike up and then really starts accelerating. Those red dots there at the tail are really when direct measurements through some of the government scientific organizations actually started measuring concentrations. And so there's a pretty clear direction to industrialization, not necessarily oil and gas. That chart below, which is intentionally difficult to read, is an estimate of where the sources are, both by source category and by geography of atmospheric methane. And oil and gas is that darker green bar in there. And so certainly there's a piece that our industry is responsible for. And then I just want to, if you add those bars up for oil and gas, it's about 80 teragrams per year. And don't worry about the units. 80 is the important number. So that's the estimate of the global number. And I'll get into in a moment that that number isn't precise. It's still largely estimated, but these are kind of in the ballpark. So why 80 matters and why methane mitigation is so important to our industry and really very important to ExxonMobil. This visual is a lot of data on here. Again, I'm just going to focus on one on the left-hand column. This is estimates that scientists under this initiative called the Global Methane Budget pull together every few years. This most recent update was led by Stanford University, but had access to global experts and multi-year effort. And so this is an estimate of all the material balance of atmospheric methane from all sources, both sources and deposits, and where methane does get mitigated or eliminated. And so there's 2 numbers on here I want to point out. The number on the far left that shows the 120 and the 115, that's oil, gas, and coal use. And all 3 of those have about equal contributions. So again, I talked about the 80 number, oil and gas, each about 40 teragrams per year. So that's 80 of that 120. Coal makes up the delta. And then the red box at the upper right is the material balance gap. And so that's excess methane, and that leads to that really high increase curve on the previous slide. So we as a world are off by about 40 teragrams per year. Oil and gas makes up 80. And so you can see why there's a large driver that says, hey, oil and gas, if you can go mitigate your methane, you can help balance this methane out. I think most of us know methane has a very short lifespan in the environment, 10 to 12 years. And so if our industry alone, and the other industries are going to need to figure out their resolutions as well, we can knock out that 40 over the next decade or so, then the world starts to reach equilibrium, and actually the atmospheric concentrations reduce quite rapidly in tens of years versus hundreds of years. And there we can start to see a temperature benefit as a society. So this is the underlying science. This is why we're talking about this and why it's so important for industry. What drives our strategy for addressing this, which is largely a mitigation strategy, we'll talk about the quantification in a minute, is really the emphasis is the industry has underreported versus what scientists are seeing in the environment. Our theory has been, and I think the academic literature backs it up, is most of the discrepancy between what industry thinks we're emitting and what's being measured in the environment is largely due to non-routine, somewhat large releases that technology to date hadn't been able to identify, right? We're dealing with an invisible odorless gas, often from facilities that are unmanned and remote locations. And so you can see from that bottom left visual, this is just a screenshot from one of the many public tools and websites available that show a compilation of what the public satellites are observing. I think this was just a few months that I pulled last fall. And you can see there's quite a few very large, as Arsene had mentioned, these public satellites only see very large events. And so there's still quite a few of those. And as the technology gets better, these numbers even get bigger. More and more non-routine, unexpected historically. And so this has been a big focus of our program. Just as a data point, just to show some of the uncertainty and the opportunity as we evolve and the focus on natural gas particularly and its carbon footprint, driven largely by its methane leakage. These are both from the International Energy Agency's most recent report and just shows the disparity by their estimates in both the country's total emissions and intensity of emissions. And then I just picked the United States as an example of all the different organizations or research studies that have tried to estimate what the emissions are in the US. And I just really wanted to demonstrate the visual difference. Again, you don't need to really pay attention to the numbers, but these are all very smart, intelligent, well thought out research studies that show very different answers. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for us to better understand this. And again, we would maintain these discrepancies are largely driven by poor understanding of non-routine emissions. Which leads us to ExxonMobil's strategy. Again, I don't think this is that unique. I think how we might approach it may be slightly different, but largely this is our approach. I'll start in the middle. Again, our company and many others, there's over 100 companies that have committed to eliminating methane from their operations or make reasonable efforts by 2030. So the core of that is, were there sources I know about, I should try to engineer or operate those out. I should minimize flaring. I should get rid of equipment like pneumatic devices. To the extent that I can manage compressor or engine leakage, I should try and address that. So that's sort of base business, but really the focus for ours is that upper section of I need to identify and address non-routine sources. And so I will quickly just touch on those technologies. I'm going to skip over this. There's some science that says that non-routine or these very large releases can make up 50, 60, 70% of your total footprint. We tend to believe that, particularly the 50%. Certainly as you become a better operator and you become more aware of these, that percentage goes down and then it drives you to go get rid of these routine sources. So I just quickly just want to talk about our strategy. And so as technology has evolved, we certainly utilize some of the technologies, really all the technologies you've already heard about, satellites, drones, fixed wing aircraft, a combination of those, but we've really driven and evolved towards continuous monitoring on the ground. And that is evolving literally as we speak. It's a combination as well. And so that table at the upper right is really our strategy for deploying that on the complexity, largely driven. So the more potential for emissions of a site, whether it's complex, a lot of moving parts, or it's close to a community, we'll put more technology, largely cameras, which can see relatively small methane leaks 24 hours a day in most environments. And then as we get to simpler sites, a single wellhead, a produced water tank, we may just put localized point sensors that are low cost. They don't give you a lot of information other than they'll send an indication that says, I see methane, someone should come take a look. I've got some visuals there of what the current camera technology that we're utilizing. We install it about 20 to 30 meters in the air, so it can have a downward view of the operational facility. And again, this is 24/7, day or night. It does have some performance opportunities in extreme weather and around water, and those are issues that we're going to work ourselves through. Again, some more applications. I don't know if this video will work here near the bottom. This is what it visualizes. So it makes the invisible visible. It will pull that information up to a screen that the operator can see. And it even makes an estimate of the quantity. And so just a smattering of the technologies. We do use drones, as mentioned before, to fill in sort of the geographic areas where the sensors don't make sense. I just want to get to I think you've seen this visualization. This is some of our fixed wing aircraft and satellite performance. I think you're all aware of the ecosystem of satellites that is here and on its way. This is somewhat dated. The world has lost EDF's methane sat recently. And then I really just want to spend my last minute on what do we do with all this information? So again, all this technology and was driven by a need for accelerating mitigation, with quantification really being a secondary issue. Again, with the mindset of driving to zero, whether a source is 5 kilograms or 20 kilograms really doesn't drive our decision making. Our goal is zero. It may prioritize it a little bit on urgency, but that fidelity wasn't a primary consideration for us. But just to finish up, is all that data, we have built a control center at our headquarters here in Houston that all of our global data is going to come into. And so there's some pictures physically of the room. It looks like a typical oil and gas control center. It's staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with former operators. And they get some of that visualization on the right. And so if a leak shows up in any location, whether it's from a continuous sensor, an airplane, a satellite, it will instantly pop to the top of his screen. It will show them where it's at, what the emissions are. We're even getting AI involved where it'll speculate what might have happened. Now, he'll certainly need to confirm that. And we're getting the technology where he can actually potentially mitigate that from here in Houston, anywhere in the world. But for now, most of the scenarios drive where he will call an operator in the local area, and they will have very detailed information on exactly where the source comes from, when it started, and then we'll have data on the back end on when it ended. So this is something we're really proud of. We call it Comet. If any of you are in Houston, I'd love to show it to you and walk you through it. So with that, Adam, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate the detailed overview of a lot of the different drivers for the work Exxon's doing. Thanks for sharing that. Again, final opportunities to getting questions and answers to the panelists that you may have. I'm going to start off with a question I think that's coming both from the audience and something that I hear when I'm in policy conversations in different parts of the world. There seems to be this view that methane detection and quantification technologies are just a thing that's based in the US and Canada, and there's not wide availability outside that region. I'd love, Matt, you and Arsena to maybe comment a bit on how you think about scaling technology outside of those regions as US-based companies, and then maybe move on to Elga after that to talk about the timelines that it took for Ecopetrol to get some of these aircraft-based technologies into the region.
I'll start, Arsena, and please correct me. A couple different approaches to that. I will say a lot of these particularly localized detection technologies were born out of North America, US, from US universities with a lot of government support in the early days. So I do think a lot of these relatively small companies did have their beginnings in the US. But certainly because of work that many of us on this call have led, we're starting to see that some of those barriers break down, right? And Arsen, I think, mentioned some of the airplanes having a more global appeal. Certainly the satellites have global reach. And we have now started to encourage some of our technology partners and have already started to deploy some of those technologies outside the US. So I think we're starting to make really tremendous progress.
Thanks. Matt set it up exactly the way that the next step would be. So Matt mentioned partnerships, and I think partnerships with the technology providers and guiding the deployment in locations, and also partnerships within the companies that are in locations. I would say that because a lot of tests have been done in US, now we have a good handle on what technologies lead to success in better data and mitigation. And so it's the next step is to work with those companies for global deployment. One thing to keep in mind is in different places, different types of rules and regulations for deployment are available. And so a holistic approach of those challenges, and again, going back to this partnership and deployment, but also the desire to reduce methane emissions is what allows us to have scalable, actionable data from technology that already has been tested and proven and now can be deployed.
Thanks. Elga, do you have anything to add maybe about your experience in bringing technologies to Colombia?
Gracias, muy amables. Bueno, nosotros desde el año 2019 hemos venido aplicando estas mediciones directas bottom-up con lo que ya las compañías internas colombianas tenían dentro de su oferta. Y las tecnologías top-down, que básicamente fueron como las que nos llevaron a conocer mejor esta detección de metano, las logramos aplicar a través de convenios internacionales, financiaciones internacionales con el gobierno canadiense y con UNEP. Y básicamente ahí es donde pudimos nosotros, participando en este estudio, permitir que esta tecnología con estas universidades se ejecute. Aquí el reto está en que justamente pues la tecnología se aplica, la universidad nos soporta y pues de una vez sale del país porque la tecnología misma aplicada no tiene esta representatividad con compañías directas en Colombia. Sin embargo, pues al momento nuestro gran reto es poder identificar ya hoy con todas las compañías y con el avance tecnológico que ha permitido este camino para toda Colombia, poder identificar qué compañías ya tienen estas tecnologías para la oferta en nuestro país. Ese es el reto que nos viene a nosotros, la aplicación de tecnologías locales que ya pudieran estar asimilando tecnología canadiense o americana. Esa es nuestra experiencia al momento.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. It definitely sounds like there's a need to develop markets to bring technology into these countries, and certainly hearing a lot of different approaches for how that's happening. There's I would say, a theme in the questions that we've been getting in on how you assess technology trade-offs for different programs. I'm getting the sense that a lot of folks are struggling with things like the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 and focusing on things like quantification, uncertainty, reconciliation, detection. How do you rank the importance of different features of technologies when you think about this space? How do you think about the relative importance of detection, quantification, and uncertainty as you're thinking through technology selection? I'll start out with Arsenal on that, move to Matt, and then Elga on that particular piece.
Thanks, Adam. So when we're thinking about that, this is a great question because it goes to the heart of how you choose technology. And how you choose technology is what question you're trying to answer. And so the question you're trying to answer is whether it's fitting within the framework of a specific requirement with a specific program. Is it for large-scale deployment? Is it for detection and quantification? Is it for understanding what the emissions are and mitigation, or all of the above. And so different types of technologies lend themselves to answering these questions specifically. But in Chevron, we start with the criteria of understanding what the technology's capabilities in terms of detection rate, how they make measurements of uncertainties. And I want to share a small bit of the work that I do. If a vendor tells you that the uncertainty of all of their measurements is the same percentage or the same number, you challenge that, because the vendors should be making measurements of understanding their uncertainties of measurements based on where and under what circumstances they make the measurements. Elga talked about different types of conditions, and we know a lot of these technologies, especially aerial technologies, need wind direction and wind speed for better data. Depending on how they get that is going to impact the uncertainty of the data that they collect. So based on testing a lot of different technologies, we have accumulated this criteria for the detection limit, the uncertainty and how uncertainty is measured, the localization, because that leads to actionable data. And then one of the other things that we use, there are a few locations where technology can be tested, either blind tested or the results are publicly available. We also ask the vendors to share those data with us. And so those type of information combined with our criteria lead us to use technology that fits all of the criteria that I talked about, which then it automatically gives you data that you need for the programs or all of the other questions that I listed at the beginning.
So I agree with everything she just said. First of all, and I often get accused of undermining the importance of quantification and the accuracy of quantification. So I want to just acknowledge up front that it is important, and I appreciate that external stakeholders need that information to be able to, in a future world where there's differentiated natural gas, or to defend the role of fossil fuels in the future energy mix. I understand that and appreciate that. But all I would add to Arsana's comment is one of our maybe unique inspirations and drivers for technology selection is usability and how actionable the data is. Because at the end of the day, if our operations team can't quickly action this data, then we really haven't added a lot of value. And so that's been maybe the only unique, and again, I'm sure Chevron has that as a priority too, but I would say you can get lost in either regulatory or OGMP requirements on all those things you mentioned, Adam, uncertainty and reconciliation. Important, but at the end of the day, your operations team needs to know what that data is telling them and be able to action it. And so that's been a big priority for us as we select and deploy technologies.
Thanks, Elga. Elga, would you like to add anything else to this?
Sí, yo agregaría que nosotros como operadores justamente estamos focalizados en la cuantificación y una variable muy importante es ese nivel de detección y la probabilidad de detección. Así que para nosotros, como lo menciona Matthew, es importante identificar cada tecnología con cada una de las condiciones operativas que tenemos de manera diversa en la misma compañía. Así que para nosotros es muy importante justamente estos niveles de detección para poder identificar con precisión nuestra emisión y poder actuar sobre la reducción de la misma.
Thanks for that. There's a number of questions in the chat that talk about offshore technologies, where historically there have been challenges with sort of the reflectivity of water and other pieces. How are you guys thinking about for offshore operations, either globally or in the Latin American region? How are you thinking about approaches that may work in that particular jurisdiction? Again, maybe start with Matt, Arsana, and then move on to Elga.
I can go first because it's a short answer. We're somewhat fortunate as ExxonMobil doesn't have a significant offshore presence. I mean, we do have some offshore presence, certainly in South America, in Guyana, with 4 FPSOs. And so we do need to develop that. It's a challenge. It's an opportunity. You're right. All the technologies that were really, again, born out of North America, US, Canada over the last decade have limitations: water reflectivity, high winds, complex structures in an offshore setting. It's making us rethink. And so I think our initial approaches, and what we've heard some others in industry, is this network of continuous sensors, think gas detectors. And there's a handful of vendors at least in the US, that have developed very low cost, actually pretty clever networking solutions that are classified to be in hazardous areas. And so we don't know if it's going to work yet. Again, I think you have to be honest with yourself on what is my primary objective. Is it mitigation or quantification? And those don't have to be separate, but I think you have to prioritize, particularly in these early days as technology continues to evolve.
Thanks. Arsena, anything to add?
Yeah, I second what Matt said about it's basically the frontier of measurements when we talk about offshore detection. That is the area that we have the biggest opportunity for finding detection solutions that allow us to understand where the emissions are coming from for actionable data, be scalable, but also allow us to understand what the emission rates from those specific locations are for quantification. And I would say in Chevron, we have tested a lot of different technologies for offshore application and continuously test it. And I think our approach is going to be some kind of a combination of detection technology platforms for offshore measurement in order to be able to quantify and have actionable data.
Thanks. Elga, do you have anything to add about offshore in your experience, or if that's part of Ecopetrol's view, if that's part of your asset base?
No, en tecnología offshore realmente no podría agregar al momento. Tendría que pensar que habría que hacer lo mismo que hicimos onshore, poder identificar en top-down cuál es efectivamente nuestra condición de emisión y ya focalizar en bottom-up por dónde estarían teniendo la posibilidad de identificar estas fuentes de emisión, pero realmente no podría aportar experiencia de manera directa en offshore.
Thanks. There's quite a few questions in the chat from operators, I think, who are trying to build out their methane management program for the first time in the region. Could you either share your experience about if there's things you've learned throughout your experience in developing these programs that you would do differently today than maybe when you started in the past, or help in how you would think about framing out a business case for an operator that's just starting the space? That would be, I think, greatly appreciated. Start with Arsena, maybe over to Matt, and then Elga on that particular topic.
Thanks, Adam. As I mentioned before, each region, each location has its challenges. But what I would say is, if you can find companies that already have tested or brought technology in a specific country that you have operations in, then use that company's knowledge to make a business case and also smooth the path for your own setup. As an industry, we're here to share the knowledge when it comes to advanced methane detection. And so any deployments that have been done in the region, the first deployment is the most difficult because you learn the most about it and find things that you are really challenging and you didn't know about how to bring in a technology from a different country to a new location. But I think once that first barrier is done, then the business case is it's already there, it's useful, it's giving you actionable data. So might as well use the learnings from other industry members to move your business case forward.
Yeah, I guess I would just and I touched on a little bit from a scientific perspective in my slides, and that may not resonate with every business team or operations team. I think that you can generalize that, and certainly you'll need your senior leadership to reinforce it, that methane it's a real issue, it's important. And it's important, one, because it's a climate mitigation step, and two, it's good for business, right? To the extent that we can continue to promote and market our products as low carbon, and certainly as low carbon as technology allows today. The last piece that, again, depending on where your company is on their journey to decarbonization, if your mindset is the world at whatever pace or scale or scope needs to decarbonize, and the energy system needs to decarbonize, methane is the easiest and most cost effective by a lot. And as I briefly talked about at the beginning, it's the most time sensitive. And so if an organization wants to become an active participant in this decarbonization of the economy, getting rid of methane from oil and gas from our operations is really the easiest. Now, it's not easy, and it's not free or cheap, but from our work, the sort of the dollars per ton mitigation is significantly below some of the bigger steps you would take for CO2.
Thanks, Matt. Elga, what would you share with somebody who's just starting on this journey?
Gracias. Yo podría compartir que para un nuevo operador aplicar este sistema de gestión podría estar focalizado inicialmente en identificar sus superemisores con una aplicación de una tecnología top-down que pues básicamente es menor tiempo, menor costo. Podría focalizarse efectivamente cuál es ese superemisor y poder identificar de ese superemisor cómo hacer un caso de negocio de la recuperación o aprovechamiento de ese gas natural, que al final pues es un gas que yo puedo utilizar y aprovechar dentro de mi facilidad. Es lo que podría aportar frente a poder elaborar un caso de negocio, sobre todo identificar dónde es que están mis emisiones y cuál es el foco prioritario para identificación.
Thanks. I'll ask one final question that I think is coming up in a lot of different themes across the Q&A. It's how do you think about the balance between source level measurement, say things like flares or pneumatics, versus something like site level measurement technologies? And if you're thinking into a future where you're having to resolve those two, are you thinking about this more in like an augmentation, using information from both types of sources? Are you picking one or the other? How are you thinking about sort of that inventory reconciliation angle that folks are, I think, struggling with today? Matt, I may start with you, then move to Arsena, and then let Elga close this out.
Yeah, I think you answered it. It's our as much as I would love to just say it's going to be source or site or satellite or it's going to have to be a combination. And I would just add in sort of a third. Again, our approach has been more on this continuous monitoring, which is largely focused on fine deviations, right? I can understand my base emissions through these periodic source or site sampling, and then this continuous to tell me when something's different. And so it's going to be all those three together. And then I think the challenge will be for our industry is how do we do that consistently?
Arsena, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about detection technology, there's different layers of how you're trying to make your selection to lead you to answer the question that you're trying to answer at the end. So if we're thinking about source and site level measurement, in Chevron, we've had experience with using aerial technology that gives us information about both. And I think I would second what Matt was saying in terms of getting tied down with reconciliation of the source to site measurement. I think once you have actionable data to lead you to mitigation, that next step automatically comes. Although if you need the data before you go to that site, that next level, that makes things a little bit more challenging.
Thanks. I think unfortunately we're running short on time. I know it's a really important conversation, and would really first like to thank the panelists for sharing their experience and time with this panel. Second, I'd really like to thank the translation staff. It's, I think, helpful to be able to speak very technical words in both English and Spanish, and that's a skill that I don't possess, and I'm very happy that we have staff to help us out with that. So appreciate your work on that. And I'd also like to thank the more than 250 webinar participants that we had for taking some time out of your Friday to learn a little bit more about methane detection and quantification technologies. If you'd like to sign up for the webinar next week on methane inventories, there's a link in the chat or on Arpel and Ipieca's websites. Thanks so much, and I hope everybody enjoys their weekend.